Before 3 o'clock in the morning on June 3, 1980, a telephone rang in a darkened bedroom in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. The man who answered it was Zbigniew Brzezinski, the National Security Adviser to President Jimmy Carter. He had been asleep for several hours. His wife lay beside him. According to his own later account, when he heard what was being communicated to him from the other end of the line, he did not wake her. He had already calculated that within 30 minutes, if what he was being told was accurate, it would not matter. The voice on the telephone belonged to Colonel William Odom, Brzezinski's military assistant. Odom was calling from the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, the hub through which all critical defense information flowed to senior leadership. What he told Brzezinski was this: the computers at the North American Air Defense Command, NORAD, were reporting that the Soviet Union had just launched a ballistic missile attack against the United States. The screens at Strategic Air Command headquarters were showing first hundreds of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, then more than 2,000 Soviet ICBMs in flight aimed at targets across North America. Brzezinski sat alone in the dark, one phone call away from recommending a retaliatory nuclear strike to the President of the United States. He thought about the fact that everyone he had ever known would be dead within half an hour. He decided there was no point in waking his wife. He was waiting for confirmation before making that call. The confirmation never came. Instead, a third call arrived from Odom. No other warning system, no ground-based radar, no satellite sensor, no seismic monitor anywhere in the vast network of American early warning infrastructure was detecting anything. The skies were empty. The missiles did not exist. The cause of what had just happened, the cause of Zbigniew Brzezinski sitting alone in the dark, believing the world was ending, would be traced to something a military engineer had once described as a routine test. A 46-cent integrated circuit, a computer chip smaller than a postage stamp, had failed silently inside a computer at Cheyenne Mountain, inside the hollowed-out granite fortress in the Rocky Mountains that served as the nerve center of American nuclear defense. The chip had failed in a way that caused the warning system to display simulated missile counts, where the actual count should have been 0, and the system, operating exactly as it had been designed to operate, had treated what it saw as real. It was not the first time. It would not be the last. 7 months earlier, on the morning of November 9, 1979, the same warning network had generated a different kind of false alarm, one that would initiate a pattern of failures that the national security establishment would spend the next several years struggling to explain, contain, and ultimately never fully resolve. This is the story of those incidents, of the system that produced them, of the people who were inside that system when it failed, and of what that failure revealed about the world that had been built in the name of preventing exactly that kind of catastrophe. If stories like this one, the hidden moments that nearly changed everything, are the kind of history you want more of, subscribing and turning on notifications means you will not miss what comes next. These are the decisions made in the dark that the history books barely mention, the cases that were classified for decades. Now, back to Cheyenne Mountain, and the morning that started it all. The Cheyenne Mountain Complex, with construction beginning on May 18, 1961, and the facility reaching full operational status on February 6, 1967, had been built at a total cost of $142.4 million, with a single overriding purpose: to survive a nuclear attack and continue functioning. The mountain itself, a granite formation in the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains near Colorado Springs, Colorado, provided the protection. Engineers excavated 693 0 tons of granite to create the interior chambers, The 15 buildings inside the mountain, 13 with 3 floors and 2 with 2 floors, were constructed on more than 1,300 enormous steel springs, each weighing approximately 1,000 pounds. Designed to absorb the shock of a nearby nuclear detonation and prevent the buildings from shifting more than an inch. Military officials stated the facility was designed to withstand a nuclear blast many times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan from as close as 1.5 miles away. The walls of each building were welded from solid Navy-grade steel. The blast doors, which sealed the 2 main tunnels leading into the mountain, were 3 feet thick and weighed 25 tons each. There were backup power systems, backup communication systems, backup everything, a facility designed on the principle that redundancy and hardening were the only reliable defenses against the weapon it had been built to survive. Inside Cheyenne Mountain, on any given shift in the autumn of 1979, there were between several hundred and 1,000 personnel, depending on operational demands. The facility operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without exception. The NORAD Combat Operations Center, the Central Nervous System of American Nuclear Early Warning, occupied one of the larger buildings inside the mountain. It was from this center that warnings of incoming ballistic missiles would be issued if Soviet missiles were ever launched. In 1979, the facility was in the midst of a significant technological transition. An upgraded computer system called the 427M had been installed just 2 months earlier, in September, replacing older equipment that had become unreliable. The 427M system, built on Honeywell 6080 computers, was designed to process data from a network of missile warning sensors, including orbiting satellites, ground-based radar installations in Greenland, Alaska, and the continental United States, and to automatically relay that data through the Worldwide Military Command and Control System, known as WIMAX, to other command posts across the country. The system was more capable than what it replaced. It was also, as multiple investigators and auditors had noted over the years of its development, years behind schedule, well over budget, and beset with technical problems that its advocates had consistently underestimated. A 1978 report by the Government Accountability Office had concluded that the 427M system was so beset with unresolved problems that replacing the entire system might be preferable to continuing to develop it. NORAD's leadership had resisted that recommendation. The system had been commissioned, it had been built, and it had finally been installed. By the autumn of 1979, engineers and technicians at Cheyenne Mountain were still working through the 427M's remaining problems, using a third Honeywell 6080 computer, a backup to the primary and first backup machines, as a test platform for troubleshooting and scenario simulation. That third computer, the test platform, was running simulations on the morning of November 9th, 1979. The simulations included attack scenarios, detailed mathematical models of what a Soviet first strike might look like, how many missiles might be launched, what trajectories they might follow, what targets they might hit. These scenarios were standard tools for testing whether the warning system would correctly identify and characterize an attack. They were supposed to run in a sealed, isolated environment, completely separate from the operational warning system that fed real-time data to military commanders. There was supposed to be no path by which data from the test platform could migrate into the live system. There was a path. There is a particular quality to the work of nuclear early warning that is difficult to convey from the outside. The people who staffed the watch floors at Cheyenne Mountain, at SAC headquarters in Nebraska, at the National Military Command Center in Washington, were professionals doing what they had been trained to do, They arrived for their shifts, reviewed the situation from the outgoing watch team, settled into their positions, and monitored an array of screens and displays that, in the overwhelming majority of hours, showed nothing alarming. The satellites were in their orbits, the radar installations were operating. The screens showed normal background activity: space objects, weather satellites, aircraft transponders, the constant low-level noise of a planet full of things moving through the air and through space. Most shifts, nothing happened, but the training and the protocols were calibrated not for the ordinary shift, but for the extraordinary one. The duty officers had been taught what a Soviet missile attack would look like on their screens: the sudden appearance of hundreds of tracks, the distinctive signatures of ICBM launches from known Soviet missile fields, the briefer and more alarming signatures of submarine-launched missiles rising from positions potentially much closer to American shores. They had practiced responding to those scenarios in exercises. The exercises had been designed to be realistic, to create the kind of stress that a real alert would create, to train people to execute the right procedures under pressure. And because the exercises were designed to be realistic, they used realistic-looking data, the same display formats, the same track signatures, the same alarm sounds. The line between exercise and reality was maintained by a single label, a designation in the system indicating that what was displayed was simulated and not real. On the morning of November 9th, 1979, at Cheyenne Mountain, that label was missing. The morning shift had come on duty in the pre-dawn hours, taking over from the night team that had monitored the streams of data from satellites and radar systems through the previous 8 hours. The 427M system, 2 months into its operational life, was still being nursed along by a team of engineers and technicians working through a list of unresolved technical problems. The Honeywell 6080 computers on which the system ran were large. Expensive machines by the standards of 1979, each one occupied a significant portion of a computer room, but they were operating at the edge of what the technology of that era could reliably deliver for the kind of real-time, high-volume processing that missile warning demanded. The computers had been experiencing intermittent outages that caused delays in the preparation of warning summaries. Engineers had been working to identify the causes of those outages. The test program, running on the third 6080, the backup machine, was part of that effort. The officer who had been tasked with some of the test work that morning, his name has not been definitively established in any declassified document, and accounts from multiple sources refer to him only by rank and function, was, by all indications, a competent professional doing routine work. He had been assigned access to the test platform for the purpose of running diagnostic and simulation programs. Whether through a procedural lapse, a misunderstanding of which terminal connected to which system, or some combination of technical and human failures, the simulation data found its way into the operational system. He did not intend this. He did not know it had happened. He was doing his job. The procedural framework that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of data contamination had assumed a level of separation between test and operational systems that did not, in practice, exist. The 427M system had been designed with theoretical safeguards. The theoretical safeguards had not been implemented completely. The gaps between what the system was supposed to do and what it actually did were gaps that had been documented, flagged, and incompletely addressed over the years of the system's troubled development. The warning arrived on screens in the NORAD Combat Operations Center shortly before 9 o'clock on the morning of November 9th, 1979. The watch team saw, simultaneously, what appeared to be a massive coordinated launch. Hundreds of Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles departing their silos, and Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missiles rising from beneath the waters of the Atlantic and Pacific. The display depicted exactly what military planners had long theorized a Soviet first strike would look like: a simultaneous assault designed to destroy American command and control infrastructure and nuclear forces before a retaliatory strike could be ordered. The duty officer's immediate task, under established protocols, was to assess the warning's validity. They had a limited amount of time to do this. The flight time of a Soviet ICBM to targets in the continental United States was approximately 30 minutes, and a submarine-launched missile from closer waters might arrive in as few as 12. The protocols required them to convene a threat assessment conference call with the other command centers receiving the same warning data. That call was initiated almost immediately. What the conference call revealed was the first indication that something was wrong. The Defense Support Program satellites, American early warning satellites in geosynchronous orbit above the equator, capable of detecting the infrared signature of ballistic missile launches, were showing nothing. These satellites had been in continuous operation and were functioning normally. If the Soviet Union had launched hundreds of ballistic missiles, the DSP satellites should have been detecting their launch plumes. They were not. Similarly, the ground-based ballistic missile early warning system radar installations in Greenland, Alaska, and the United Kingdom, designed to track inbound missiles once they had cleared the horizon, were detecting nothing. According to the declassified account provided by Secretary of Defense Harold Brown to President Carter in a memorandum dated November 20, 1979, within less than 60 seconds of the initial alert, personnel at Strategic Air Command Headquarters and the National Military Command Center had identified these anomalies. The complete absence of corroborating data from satellite and radar systems that should have been detecting a real attack. Within approximately 6 minutes of the initial alert, the Threat Assessment Conference had concluded that the warning was spurious. 6 minutes. That was the time between the appearance of hundreds of Soviet missiles on American warning screens and the determination that they did not exist. 6 minutes during which senior military officers at multiple command centers were operating under the assumption that the Soviet Union had launched a nuclear attack. 6 minutes during which a set of predetermined protocols was unfolding: interceptor aircraft being alerted and launched, the National Emergency Airborne Command Post preparing for flight, Minuteman Missile Launch Control Centers receiving preliminary warning notifications, all moving along established pathways toward responses that, if carried to their conclusion, would have meant nuclear war. 10 interceptor fighter aircraft were scrambled from bases in North America. The National Emergency Airborne Command Post, the Boeing 747, configured to carry the President and senior military commanders aloft during a nuclear war so they could continue directing operations from the air, lifted off from Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. It carried no senior officials. Neither the President nor the Secretary of Defense had been notified. The plane took off because the protocols for a missile attack required it to take off, and the protocols were operating. And the protocols did not require anyone to stop and verify that the attack was real before initiating a set of preliminary steps whose purpose was to preserve the ability to fight a nuclear war. The machine had no mechanism for doubt. It executed. The alert was stood down. The interceptor aircraft were recalled. The Airborne Command Post returned to Andrews. The duty officers at Cheyenne Mountain who had been working through the Threat Assessment Conference call, identifying the anomalies, constructing the judgment that the warning was spurious, completed their logs, filed their reports, and handed off to the next watch. Some of them found the experience profoundly shaking in ways they had not anticipated. They had trained for exactly this kind of event. The training was supposed to prepare them to remain calm and analytical under pressure. Some of them remained calm and analytical. Others found that the training's simulation of stress was a poor approximation of the experience of looking at a screen showing hundreds of Soviet missiles and trying to determine whether reality matched what they were seeing. One technical analyst who had been on watch that morning, interviewed years later by a researcher studying nuclear command and control, described the experience of seeing the missile track counts update upward from hundreds to more than 1,000 as something that had activated a physical response he had not anticipated. His hands had begun to shake. He had been aware of his hands shaking and had been simultaneously running through the anomaly checklist in his mind, and the two things, the physiological response and the trained analytical process, had been occurring simultaneously and independently, like two different people inhabiting the same body. He found the anomalies. He correctly identified the warning as spurious, but he had not felt calm while doing it. He had felt exactly as frightened as the situation warranted. The training had taught him what to do. It had not prevented him from being afraid. His name does not appear in any declassified document. His experience does. It is one small and humanizing data point in the larger question of whether the human safeguards that Secretary of Defense Brown had described to Carter were as reliable under operational conditions as they appeared in principle. The immediate aftermath of the November 9th incident produced a set of responses at multiple levels of the U.S. government that were, in retrospect, revealing about how the national security establishment understood and valued the warning systems it had built. At the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown ordered an internal review. The review was conducted with some urgency because the incident had leaked to the press within days. The Washington Post and the New York Times both published accounts of what had happened, though the initial reporting was shaped significantly by the Pentagon briefings that preceded it. According to those briefings, the incident had been quickly identified as a false alarm and had not reached senior officials. The official framing, as a contained, quickly resolved technical malfunction that had demonstrated the robustness of the system's safeguards, was the framing that the government wanted to project, both domestically and internationally. The Soviet response was sharper than that framing would have suggested was warranted. Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev sent a formal letter to President Carter expressing concern about what he described as the tremendous danger of the incident. The Brezhnev letter was a diplomatic communication calibrated to put American officials on record and to signal that Moscow was paying attention. Carter had not known about the incident until after Brezhnev had written to him. According to a note written on the margin of Secretary of State Cyrus Vance's briefing paper summarizing the Brezhnev letter, the president noted that he had not received a report on the incident and had not been given an analysis of why it had happened. The Secretary of Defense's memorandum to the president, dated November 20th, attempted to provide that analysis while simultaneously reassuring Carter that the system had functioned adequately. Brown's memo acknowledged that corrective actions were necessary. Bugs remained in the 427M system, and the hasty launching of interceptor aircraft and the airborne command post represented procedural problems that needed to be fixed. But Brown also argued that the human safeguards in the system, the people monitoring warning data who had correctly identified the anomalies that indicated the alert was false, had worked. He told the president there was no chance that irretrievable actions would be taken based on a false alert because human judgment stood between the computer screens and the actual launch of nuclear weapons. The confidence that Brown expressed in that memorandum was both technically defensible and philosophically significant. He was describing a system in which the final safeguard against accidental nuclear war was the judgment of human beings working under extreme stress with limited information who were being asked to decide in less than 30 minutes whether what a computer was showing them was real. The State Department, in the days following the November 9th incident, briefed American allies at the North Atlantic Council on what had happened, seeking to reassure NATO partners whose cooperation on nuclear deployments in Western Europe was already under strain. The briefing materials emphasized the redundancy and reliability of American early warning systems and the effectiveness of the confirmation procedures that had identified the alert as false. They did not dwell on the 6 minutes during which those procedures were being applied while interceptor aircraft were scrambling and the President's airborne command post was lifting off from Andrews. The Soviets were given a more direct explanation, though not a complete one. American officials told their Soviet counterparts that a training tape had inadvertently been introduced into the warning system. This was the simplest available description of what had happened, and it was substantially accurate, though it omitted the technical complexity of how the 427M system's architecture had permitted that introduction to occur. What neither the American public nor the Soviet government was told, in November 1979, was that the incident was not isolated. The 427M system would generate 3 more false alarms within the following 8 months. On May 28, 1980, the warning system again indicated a Soviet missile attack, with displays at SAC headquarters briefly showing thousands of inbound missiles before the signal disappeared. Then, on June 3, 1980, the most consequential of the follow-on incidents unfolded. Shortly before 3 in the morning, Colonel William Odom, the same officer who had managed the November 1979 response, listened in on a Pentagon conference call that was working to determine whether warning indicators showing hundreds of submarine launched and then more than 2,000 ballistic missiles were real. He reported to Brzezinski afterward that the experience had been eerie. Brzezinski, awakened in his Maryland bedroom, sat alone with the information while waiting for confirmation from other sensors. No confirmation came. The third call from Odom brought the determination. The skies were clear. The missiles did not exist. Brzezinski did not call the President. He went back to sleep. The cause of the June 3rd incident was subsequently identified as the failure of a 46-cent integrated circuit, a computer chip smaller than a postage stamp, in one of NORAD's computers. The chip had failed in a way that caused the system to intermittently display simulated missile counts where the actual count should have been 0. On June 6, 1980, the warning indicators activated again, for the same reason. Secretary of Defense Brown reported to Carter that the 46-cent chip had been identified as the probable cause of the June incidents. He also reported that NORAD had been unable to make the chip fail again under test conditions. It had produced its warnings, silently corrected itself, and left investigators with no mechanism they could reproduce or explain, a pattern that had troublingly echoed the November incident just months before. Brown told the President, in his follow-up memorandum, that the United States must be prepared for the possibility that another unrelated malfunction might someday generate another false alert, while maintaining that human judgment would remain the safeguard, ensuring no irreversible action would be taken. He was describing a system that he acknowledged would continue to generate false alarms, while arguing that the human beings positioned at the end of that system would reliably distinguish those alarms from the real ones. The 427 million false alarms of 1979 and 1980 occurred in a specific geopolitical context that mattered enormously to the risk they carried. November 1979 was not a moment of particular stability in Soviet-American relations. The preceding years had seen a deterioration of the détente that had characterized the early 1970s, driven by a combination of Soviet adventurism in Angola and the Horn of Africa, American domestic political pressures, and the collapse of the SALT II ratification process in the U.S. Senate. 2 months after the November 9th false alarm, in December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The invasion shattered what remained of the Carter administration's efforts to maintain constructive engagement with Moscow and marked the beginning of what many historians have called the Second Cold War, a period of heightened tension and mutual suspicion that would intensify sharply through the early 1980s. In that environment, a false alarm was not simply a technical malfunction. It was an event occurring against a backdrop of genuine strategic anxiety. American military planners in 1979 were acutely aware that Soviet strategic forces had grown substantially through the 1970s and that the Soviet deployment of SS-20 intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Europe had created new pressures on NATO. The NATO double-track decision of December 1979, the decision to deploy American Pershing II missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles in Western Europe while simultaneously pursuing arms control negotiations, was itself a response to that anxiety. It was also, from the Soviet perspective, a provocation. The Pershing II missiles, deployed in West Germany, could reach targets in the Western Soviet Union within approximately 6 minutes of launch. Soviet military planners experienced that proximity as a form of existential pressure that their American counterparts, whose homeland was geographically insulated from medium-range European missiles, found difficult to fully appreciate. In that climate, with both sides feeling pressured, with communication channels that were formal and slow, with each side operating warning systems of varying reliability, the margin for error was narrow in ways that neither government fully acknowledged publicly. The false alarms at NORAD were happening to an American system. Soviet early warning systems were experiencing their own problems, though these were even less publicly known. Soviet military satellites and radar installations had their own failure modes, their own blind spots, their own procedures for distinguishing real attacks from anomalies. Soviet military doctrine, moreover, placed a higher premium on rapid response than American doctrine did, partly because Soviet geography offered less early warning time for an attack coming from Western Europe, and partly because Soviet military thinking emphasized the importance of not absorbing a first strike passively. The combination of American systems generating false alarms and Soviet systems operating under their own pressures and uncertainties created a situation in which the risk of a catastrophic miscalculation was not theoretical. It was structural. It was embedded in the architecture of the deterrent systems that both sides had built to prevent exactly that kind of catastrophe. The men who built and operated those systems in the 1970s and 1980s understood this to varying degrees. Among the engineers and procurement officials who had pushed forward the 427M system, despite the Government Accountability Office's 1978 recommendation to scrap it, there were institutional and bureaucratic pressures that made abandoning the system, after years of development, hundreds of millions of dollars spent, and deep organizational commitments made, practically and politically, very difficult. The system existed. It had been installed. It would be fixed. The alternative, starting over, was not a real option in the world of defense procurement and military schedules. Among the duty officers at Cheyenne Mountain, the people who were watching warning displays when the false alarms occurred, there was a different set of pressures. They had been trained to respond to warning indications. They had protocols to follow. The protocols had been designed on the assumption that the most dangerous failure mode was failing to respond to a real attack. Not failing to identify a false alarm. The asymmetry was deliberate. In a world where a Soviet first strike might arrive with as little as 12 minutes of warning, the cost of not responding to a real attack was catastrophic and irreversible. The cost of responding to a false alarm, scrambling interceptor aircraft, alerting missile crews, waking the National Security Adviser, was significant but recoverable. The protocols reflected that asymmetry. What the protocols did not adequately account for was the possibility that responding to a false alarm might itself become catastrophic, not because of anything the American side did, but because of how the Soviet side interpreted the response. If Soviet intelligence or Soviet early warning systems had detected American interceptor aircraft being scrambled, the doomsday plane taking off, American missile forces going to alert status, without understanding that this was in response to a false alarm, the Soviet interpretation of those activities might have been that the Americans were preparing a first strike and that Soviet forces needed to launch before they were destroyed on the ground. This was not a hypothetical concern. Soviet intelligence was actively monitoring American military activities. American communications were not entirely opaque to Soviet signals intelligence. The picture that Soviet analysts might have assembled from fragments of activity during the November 1979 or June 1980 incidents would have been incomplete and potentially alarming. American forces suddenly elevated to alert status, with no political context, no preceding diplomatic crisis, no warning. The Soviets would not have known it was a false alarm. They would have seen the effect and tried to infer the cause. The American officials who reviewed the incidents were aware of this dynamic, at least in part. State Department cables sent to American allies in the aftermath emphasized the robustness of American confirmation procedures, specifically to reassure those allies that a false alarm could not trigger an inadvertent American nuclear strike. What the cables did not address was the mirror problem, whether American responses to false alarms, if observed by Soviet intelligence, might themselves trigger a Soviet response. The reform efforts that followed the 1979 and 1980 false alarms were real, though their pace and scope were constrained by the same institutional pressures that had produced the problematic system in the first place. NORAD invested approximately $16 million in the construction of an off-site test facility, physically separate from the operational warning system at Cheyenne Mountain, so that simulation programs could no longer inadvertently contaminate live warning displays. A 1981 General Accounting Office report cited this as an essential improvement. The 427M system's computer architecture was modified to address the backup system failure mode that had apparently occurred on November 9th. Procedures for personnel with access to the test systems were tightened. The Secretary of Defense's assurances to the President that human safeguards would prevent irreversible actions from being taken on the basis of false alerts became, in subsequent years, a kind of institutional mantra. The system could generate false alarms. The humans at the end of the system would catch them. This was the argument, and it was not without foundation. The anomaly detection procedures had worked on November 9th. Within 60 seconds, personnel at SAC and the National Military Command Center had identified the absence of corroborating sensor data that should have been present if the attack were real. The Threat Assessment Conference had resolved the question within 6 minutes. The system, in this narrow sense, had functioned as intended, but the argument rested on an assumption about human reliability under extreme stress that was itself uncertain. It assumed that the people making those judgments would always notice the anomalies, always ask the right questions, always wait long enough for the confirmation that would indicate a false alarm. At 3 in the morning, after being awakened by a phone call, with a clock running that said 30 minutes or less remained, Brzezinski had done it correctly on June 3, 1980. He had waited. He had been right. But the correctness of his judgment had been, to a significant degree, a function of his personal temperament, his analytical disposition, and a particular set of circumstances, including the absence of any corroborating data, which made the false alarm relatively straightforward to identify. In different circumstances, with different data patterns or with a different person on the other end of the phone, the outcome might have been different. This was the uncomfortable truth that the institutional response to the false alarms of 1979 and 1980 did not fully confront. The humans' safeguards worked because the humans exercised good judgment. The good judgment had been exercised in conditions that, while stressful, had not been maximally ambiguous. The question of whether human judgment would remain reliable in more genuinely ambiguous conditions, in conditions closer to a real attack, where the absence of corroborating data might be explained by sensor failures rather than the absence of missiles, was a question that could not be answered by improving the test facility at Cheyenne Mountain. 4 years after the NORAD false alarms, on the night of September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov of the Soviet Air Defense Forces was the duty officer at Serpukhov 15, a secret command bunker located outside Moscow from which the Soviet Union monitored its satellite-based early warning system. Serpukhov 15 was the Soviet equivalent of NORAD, the facility that would receive the first warning of an American missile attack and relay it up the chain of command. Petrov was 44 years old. He had spent much of his career working in the Soviet military's technical establishments, and his path to Serpukhov 15 had been shaped by his aptitude for systems and mathematics rather than the operational military career paths that led other officers to command positions. He was not supposed to be on duty that night. He was filling in for a colleague. He was a careful man by temperament and by training, someone who had spent years thinking professionally about the difference between what sensors detected and what was actually occurring, about the gap between signal and reality that was the fundamental epistemological problem of military early warning. The satellite system he was monitoring, called OKO, had been placed into service in late 1982, making it less than a year old at the time of the incident. It was the Soviet Union's newest and most sophisticated missile warning technology, designed to detect the infrared heat plumes of ballistic missile launches from Molniya orbit, a highly elliptical orbit that gave the satellites extended coverage over the northern hemisphere. It was also, in September 1983, a system whose reliability had not yet been thoroughly established. Petrov knew this. He had been briefed on the system's characteristics and on its limitations. He was aware that its algorithms were not yet fully proven, that there were conditions under which it might generate false positives. The political context in which Petrov was sitting watch that night was, if anything, more charged than the context of the NORAD incidents. 3 weeks earlier, on September 1st, Soviet Air Defense Forces had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after the passenger aircraft inadvertently entered Soviet airspace. All 269 people aboard were killed. The incident had produced a severe deterioration in Soviet-American relations, with President Reagan delivering a speech condemning the shootdown that the Soviet leadership experienced as an existential threat to Soviet legitimacy. NATO was in the process of deploying the Pershing II missiles in Western Europe that the Soviet military had been dreading. Reagan had earlier that year, in a speech on March 8, 1983, publicly characterized the Soviet Union as an evil empire, language that Soviet leaders interpreted as signaling an American willingness to consider aggressive military action. In that environment, the early warning satellite system that Petrov was monitoring received a signal shortly after midnight. The word that appeared on his screen, in Russian, was launch. The system was reporting that one American intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched from a base in the continental United States and was heading toward Soviet territory. Petrov's situation was structurally similar to the one that had faced the duty officers at Cheyenne Mountain on November 9, 1979, but with crucial differences. The Soviet protocols for responding to missile warning were more rigid than the American ones. The chain of command that Petrov was sitting within ran directly to the Soviet military high command, which would relay the warning to Soviet political leadership, which would face the same 30-minute decision window that American leaders faced. And the Soviet doctrine for response to an American first strike, a doctrine that Petrov had been trained in and understood, held that the appropriate response was massive immediate retaliation. Petrov looked at his screen. He saw one missile. He thought about what he had been taught, that any American first strike would be a massive coordinated launch, designed to destroy Soviet forces before they could respond. One missile made no military sense as a first strike. One missile, if successfully intercepted or if it missed its target, would accomplish nothing. One missile would have no strategic rationale. Petrov's training, the very training that Brown's memorandum to Carter had cited as the foundation of human safeguards, was working exactly as intended. It was telling him that what he was seeing might be wrong. The system updated. Now it was showing not one missile, but 5. 5 missiles still defied the logic of a nuclear first strike. But 5 was more alarming than 1, and Petrov's protocols required him to report upward if his system was indicating a launch. He had, in principle, a very short amount of time to decide whether to do that. If he reported the launch as real, the chain of command would accelerate toward a response. If he did not report it, or reported it as a probable false alarm, he was making a unilateral judgment that could be career-ending if he was wrong, or world-saving if he was right. Petrov decided not to report the warning as valid. He would describe his reasoning afterward as a combination of analytical judgment and something less precise, a sense that the evidence did not add up, that the new satellite system, whose performance he had reason to doubt, was showing him something anomalous, that the logic of 1 or 5 missiles as a first strike was simply wrong. He later told interviewers that when people start a war, they don't start it with only 5 missiles. He was right. The Soviet satellite system had misinterpreted sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds over missile fields in the northern continental United States. The specific geometric alignment, the Molniya orbit the Soviet satellite was following, the angle of the sun, the altitude and composition of the clouds had produced infrared signatures that the system's algorithms had classified as missile launch plumes. It was a rare alignment related to the position of the autumnal equinox. It would eventually be corrected by cross-referencing data from geostationary satellites that were not subject to the same geometric distortion. The correction came too late to prevent the false alarm. It came in time, because of Petrov's decision, to prevent the response. The incident at Serpukhov 15 remained classified by the Soviet government until after the Cold War ended. Petrov did not receive a commendation. He received, according to his own later account, a reprimand for improperly completing the required paperwork during the incident. He was eventually reassigned to a less sensitive post and retired from the military early. In the official Soviet record of the event, his decision, the decision that may have been the most consequential individual act of the Cold War, was noted primarily as an administrative failure. His superiors were, in retrospect, not entirely wrong to be uncomfortable with what he had done. Petrov had, in a technical sense, violated protocol. He had reached a personal conclusion that a computer-generated warning was false and had declined to pass that warning up the chain of command in the way the protocols required. If his conclusion had been wrong, if the 5 missiles had been real, his personal judgment would have cost the Soviet Union 30 minutes of response time, and the planet would have faced a nuclear attack to which there had been no retaliatory response. The fact that his judgment was correct does not, in any procedural or institutional sense, validate the judgment. It validates the outcome. But a system that depends on a single individual's correct judgment in a moment of maximum stress and minimum information is not a system in which institutional planners can reliably place their confidence, regardless of how the outcome happened to resolve. This was the paradox that both the American and Soviet incidents exposed. The NORAD false alarm of November 9, 1979, was resolved because the anomaly detection procedures worked and because the duty officers maintained discipline long enough to find the corroborating data that was absent. The Soviet false alarm of September 26, 1983, was resolved because Petrov trusted his instincts over his computer screen. Both outcomes depended on human judgment. Human judgment can fail. Neither outcome was guaranteed. Both were, in some meaningful sense, fortunate. The broader pattern of false alarms during the Cold War, of which the 1979 and 1980 NORAD incidents and the 1983 Petrov incident were the most significant, was not publicly known in anything approaching its full complexity until long after the Cold War ended. American false alarms were classified matters, disclosed to limited audiences within the national security establishment and to American allies on a need-to-know basis. Soviet false alarms were even more tightly held. The publics in both countries were living with a level of risk that their governments had not disclosed and would not have disclosed. Approximately 6 weeks after Petrov's decision at Serpukhov 15 in early November 1983, NATO conducted a major military exercise called Able Archer 83, designed to simulate the procedures for a nuclear release in the event of a war in Europe. The exercise began on November 7th and ran through November 11th. It was realistic to an unusual degree. It incorporated communications procedures and command structures that closely resembled the actual protocols that would be used in a real nuclear escalation. Soviet intelligence, monitoring the exercise, became alarmed. KGB and military intelligence analysts concluded that Able Archer might not be an exercise at all, but an actual preparation for a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union, using the cover of a military exercise as camouflage. Soviet forces in Eastern Europe were put on alert. Some Soviet aircraft in Poland and East Germany were loaded with nuclear weapons and placed on heightened readiness. The Able Archer episode was eventually assessed by American intelligence analysts in a still partially classified review as one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War, a period when Soviet leaders may have genuinely believed they were on the brink of a nuclear attack. President Reagan was reportedly shocked when he received intelligence briefings about the depth of Soviet concern following Able Archer, having apparently not fully appreciated how American military posture and rhetoric had been received in Moscow. Declassified documents from the 1990s and 2000s suggest that Reagan's reaction to learning about Soviet fear helped motivate a significant shift in his approach to Soviet relations in his second term, a shift toward engagement that would eventually produce the arms reduction treaties of the late 1980s. The connection between these events, the NORAD false alarms of 1979 and 1980, the Petrov incident of September 1983, and the Able Archer scare of November 1983, was not a coincidence. They were all expressions of the same underlying problem. Two superpowers operating warning systems of imperfect reliability in an environment of political hostility and mutual suspicion under time constraints that made careful deliberation nearly impossible, with communication channels that were formal and slow, each assuming the worst about the other's intentions. The decision not to inform the public was, from the perspective of the officials who made it, straightforward. Public knowledge of repeated false alarms would undermine confidence in the warning systems whose credibility was essential to deterrence. If the American public understood that NORAD was generating false alerts of nuclear attack with some regularity, the political pressure to modify or constrain the deterrent architecture could become unmanageable. The same logic applied with different political inflections. In the Soviet Union, deterrence required the credible threat of response. The credible threat of response required warning systems that were perceived as reliable. Systems that were perceived as reliable could not be openly malfunctioning. The secrecy was, in this sense, rational, given the imperatives of deterrence. It was also, given the nature of the risks the false alarms exposed, a form of collective self-deception that prevented the kind of serious, publicly accountable reckoning with those risks that might have been possible. Congressional scrutiny of the false alarms was limited. The Government Accountability Office reports that had warned about the 427M system's problems had been available technically as public documents, but their implications had not been translated into political pressure for the kind of fundamental restructuring of early warning architecture that the incidents, in retrospect, suggested was warranted. The reforms that followed the 1979 and 1980 false alarms were real but incremental. An off-site test facility, modified procedures, additional training. They addressed the specific failure modes that had been identified. They did not address the fundamental tension between the speed demanded by nuclear warning protocols and the time required for reliable human judgment. Brzezinski, in the years after leaving government, would discuss the false alarm incidents with a directness that stood in contrast to the careful official framing that had characterized the immediate aftermath. In interviews and in his writing, he described sitting alone in the dark on the morning of June 3, 1980, calculating that everyone would be dead in half an hour. He described the experience as clarifying, not in the sense that it had resolved anything, but in the sense that it had made the abstract concrete. In his later public statements, he consistently held that arms control negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union were not simply a diplomatic exercise or a political gesture, but a practical necessity. A world with fewer weapons, with more communication between the two sides, with better procedures for distinguishing accidents from attacks, was a world with a slightly larger margin of safety, a slightly larger buffer between a computer error and the end of the world. The SALT II treaty that Carter had negotiated with the Soviets and that was awaiting ratification in the Senate when the first false alarm occurred was never ratified. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which followed 6 weeks after the November 9th incident, killed any remaining possibility of Senate approval. The strategic arms limitation process was effectively suspended for several years. The $16 million off-site test facility that NORAD built after the 1979 incidents was completed in 1981. It is a small and specific monument to the gap between how the world was supposed to work and how it actually worked on the morning of November 9, 1979. Stanislav Petrov lived until 2017. He died on May 19th of that year at the age of 77 in his apartment in Fryazevo, a small town outside Moscow. His death was not immediately reported publicly. News of it spread slowly through international media over the following months. He had spent the years after the 1983 incident in relative obscurity, working as an engineer after leaving the military, living modestly. In his later years, after the incident became known publicly following the collapse of the Soviet Union, he received some international recognition: a humanitarian award in Dresden, a visit to the United Nations, a documentary film. He described these recognitions with a mixture of gratitude and discomfort, noting that he did not consider himself a hero, that he had done what seemed correct given what he knew, and that he had been lucky. Petrov told an interviewer in 2013 that he was simply doing his job and that he had been in the right place at the right time. In the same conversation, he acknowledged that the question of whether his decision had saved the world was one he could not answer with certainty, that he had made a judgment call based on incomplete information, and that the information had turned out to support his judgment, but that the counterfactual could not be tested. He could not know what Soviet leadership would have done if he had reported the warning as valid. He could not know whether Soviet political leaders would have authorized a retaliatory strike on the basis of 5 missiles, or whether they too would have paused and questioned the data. He knew only what he had done and that it had turned out to be correct. Zbigniew Brzezinski died on May 26, 2017, 1 week after Petrov, at the age of 89. They had never met. They had faced structurally similar moments of decision across the span of those years, on opposite sides of the planet, on opposite sides of the Cold War, with opposite information. Brzezinski holding a telephone in the dark, being told thousands of missiles were inbound; Petrov watching a screen in a bunker outside Moscow, being told 5 missiles were inbound, and had each made a judgment call that proved correct. The outcomes did not differ because one system was better than the other, or because one man was wiser than the other. They differed because of circumstance: different amounts of corroborating data, different system architectures, different decision frameworks, different amounts of time. The correctness of both decisions was, in any rigorous analysis, also a function of fortune. The incidents of 1979, 1980, and 1983 did not have names in the years that followed. They were referred to in government documents as the NORAD false alarms, or the 427M incidents, or in some contexts, simply by their dates. They were not the Cuban Missile Crisis, with its 13 days of visible public confrontation that had lodged itself permanently in the historical memory of everyone who lived through it. They were 6 minutes on a morning in Colorado, a sleepless pre-dawn hour in Maryland, a man in a bunker outside Moscow staring at a screen, events that moved quickly and left almost no visible trace. The Petrov incident eventually acquired the slightly hagiographic label, "the man who saved the world," which Petrov himself found uncomfortable and reductive. The scale of what might have happened was enormous. The visibility of what had actually happened, a man sitting in a bunker, watching a screen, choosing not to pick up a telephone, was almost non-existent. This invisibility was itself part of the problem. The systems that had been built to prevent nuclear war were operating, when they malfunctioned, in ways that were almost entirely opaque to public scrutiny. The decisions that had been made about those systems, about their architecture, their procurement, their procedures, the balance between automated response and human judgment, were made by relatively small numbers of people operating within closed institutional frameworks. The consequences of those decisions, if they had gone differently, would have been experienced by every living person on the planet. The gap between the scale of the risk and the visibility of the decision-making process that governed it was not an oversight; it was a feature. Nuclear deterrence, as it was practiced by both the United States and the Soviet Union through the Cold War, required a degree of opacity and speed that was incompatible with the kind of deliberative, publicly accountable decision-making that democratic societies nominally valued in other domains. The speed that missiles demanded, 30 minutes or less between launch and detonation, was a constraint that could not be argued with. It simply was. And in the face of that constraint, the people responsible for building and operating the warning and response systems did the best they could, and the best they could was sometimes a system that generated false alarms and depended on human judgment exercised in the middle of the night by people who had been asleep a few minutes earlier. What remains decades later is not resolution, but a set of observations. The systems worked in the most literal sense. They did not produce a nuclear war. The humans at the end of the systems exercised correct judgment on the occasions when their judgment mattered most. The outcomes were fortunate. Whether the outcomes were fortunate because the systems were well designed, or because the circumstances were favorable, or because the individuals involved happened to be people who made good decisions under pressure, is a question that cannot be answered cleanly. Brzezinski was the National Security Adviser when he sat in the dark in the early hours of June 3, 1980, and decided not to call the president. He was 89 years old when he died in 2017, and in the intervening years he had reflected extensively on that night and on what it meant. His conclusion, expressed in various forms across many years of interviews and writing, was that the episode demonstrated both the resilience and the fragility of the deterrent system. Resilient because it had caught the error before the error became catastrophic. Fragile because the margin had been a handful of minutes and one man's decision to wait. Petrov was 44 years old when he sat in his bunker in September 1983 and decided not to pick up the telephone. He was 77 years old when he died in a small apartment outside Moscow, and he had spent much of his later life insisting that what he had done was not heroic, that he had simply calculated what seemed to be true under conditions that were inherently uncertain, and that the calculation had been correct. 2 men, 2 decisions, both correct. Both made under time pressure, with incomplete information, in systems that were not as reliable as the people responsible for them had publicly claimed. The computers that generated the false alarms no longer exist. The Honeywell 6080 machines at Cheyenne Mountain were decommissioned and replaced decades ago. The satellite system that misread sunlight over the northern plains was corrected. The procedures that had allowed a simulation to contaminate a live warning system were changed. The specific failure modes that had produced the crises of 1979, 1980, and 1983 were addressed. But the underlying condition that made those crises possible, a world in which the decision to end human civilization could be triggered by a malfunctioning machine and executed in 30 minutes or less, in which the only buffer between a computer error and catastrophe was the judgment of whoever happened to be sitting in front of a screen at 3 in the morning. That condition was not addressed by building a new test facility or replacing a 46-cent computer chip. It was a structural feature of the world that deterrence had built, a system that claimed to prevent the very catastrophe its own failure could cause. That world still exists, in modified but recognizable form. The missiles are still there. The warning systems are still running. The protocols for rapid response are still in place. The people sitting in front of screens in the middle of the night, making judgments about what is real and what is not, are still there. What happened in the winter of 1979, and again in the summer of 1980, and again on a September night in 1983, is not past. It is a description of a condition that persists. The computers that almost started World War III were replaced. The problem they revealed was not.